Good morning, internet folks. What kind of camera do you have? What camera do you want? Let me know down in the comments. Now, I want to upgrade my YouTube game, and I'm choosing between two options, the Canon C70 and the RED Komodo. And in this video, I'm going to dive in to the pros and cons, for me at least, of those two cameras. For my case, I am a wildlife photographer and videographer. I currently use the Canon 90D, so I'm quite invested in the EF ecosystem. Both cameras use the Canon mount, so both cameras work very well without much hassle. Unlike my next comparison video between the winner of this video and the Sony FX6. Let's start with the RED Komodo. This camera is well known in the industry of filmmaking. RED is known for making the Apple equivalent of cameras, and by that I mean quite expensive, finely polished products. The RED Komodo comes in at a budget-friendly $8,000. It isn't exactly a starter camera, but it is from a worldwide recognized and industry accepted camera manufacturer. From what I have read online, the RED Komodo is supposed to be a cheap, expendable crash cam. But the smaller film productions have found a liking to this overpriced, glorified GoPro. Now I'm going to talk about the negatives of the RED Komodo, for me at least. The first negative is the media type. I use a lot of SD cards, and that's the media type that I'm most familiar with. The higher end RED cameras use a sort of SSD that they have geniusly called the RED Mini Mags. For me, it's just too much of a hassle to invest in different types of media. The RED Komodo uses Cfast 2.0 cards, which are quite new and expensive. Not to mention the overused, what if I forget mine and need to run into a grocery store to buy an SD card? Talking about the Cfast cards, they're quite expensive, so having many of them may not be an option. The next negative for the RED is the added cost. For me, being a small production of just me, having to purchase and rig out a complex camera rig is a negative. If you want to use this camera, you are going to need to buy a lot of attachments. The RED Komodo is outstanding and can be used in full-scale productions. That is enough of negatives. I don't like being so negative. Not to mention, I don't own it, so I can't get into fine details. So let's talk about the positives of the RED Komodo. The first positive I want to mention is the resolution. The RED Komodo is 6K, whereas the Canon C70 is only 4K. The benefits of shooting in 6K is being able to crop in to readjust framing. A well-known example of this is in the series House of Cards, where the director has the editing team reframe it to get an absolute equilibrium in regards to the amount of space on each side of the frame.
David Fincher actually does this quite a bit on House of Cards. It's one of the ways he can get those perfect symmetrical compositions, because in post they'll go in and reframe the frame to make it perfect.
Another upside of 6K is the ability to downsample, which is the process of taking 4 pixels and compressing them into 2 to create super sharp 2 pixels. That being said, you can make the sharpest 4K you have ever seen. 6K also allows for better longevity of the footage you shoot, as TVs get sharper to the point where we can't even tell the difference. The 6K footage will continue to stand out. The second positive is how professional and the brand recognition. The people that dip their toes into the industry, like the media departments of companies, they understand big brand names like RED and Canon. The second side to this point is the more professional you will look with a big, large, square body of a RED camera. In the field of media production, if you are working for clients, then they most likely have one misconception that is quite commonplace, that the bigger the camera is, the better the camera is. If you are wanting to impress those media executives, then having the letters RED on the side of your camera can sure help. Because let me tell you this, if that nosy Nelly decides to Google that name, they are going to come up with some expensive cameras. Now, you and I know the size or price of the camera isn't the most important thing. But if you are trying to impress some outsiders for whatever reason, then that is definitely an easy way to do it. Not to act as my transition between the two cameras is the middle intersecting part of the imaginary Venn diagram. What Canon C70 and the RED Komodo have in common? Let's start out with the fact that both of these cameras are not full frame, but are both a Super 35, which a few years ago would have scared me away. But now that the Arri Alexa Mini has showed everybody that 35mm is enough and can be used to make the very best, it's fine. And I am honestly very okay with buying a Super 35mm camera. Both cameras use the RF mount, and thus through the extension of the focal reducer, they also use the EF lineup, which, as I have mentioned before, I am very, very invested in. Let's switch over and talk about the opponent, the Canon C70. Now, I may be a bit partial to this camera just for the fact that I shoot predominantly on Canon, and switching out of the ecosystem would be a bit inconvenient, which is why the RED Komodo still has some hope, as it also uses the Canon ecosystem. Even though these cameras are wildly different, and I've heard a lot of people say that they shouldn't be compared, yet here's another video of them being compared. I believe that it's probably the close price range and the fact that both cameras are coming from massively big camera companies. That's enough talking about the cameras and how they compare. Let's get into the actual discussion of the Canon C70. Being released in late 2020, it is an amazing entry into Canon's cinema line cameras. It is the first cinema camera to use the RF mount, which is the new standard that Canon is rolling out. Using the 0.71 focal reducer, you can adapt your RF mount into EF mount, which basically negates the entire reason for needing an RF mount. Now, I love the EF mount line, as it's a little bit older, so they're cheap, and it's just well built out until the RF line catches up to every single one that the EF line has. I can see some hesitation that people may have. If I were to use this camera, I'd be using my Canon 100 to 400 USM II. And I'm also thinking of picking up the Canon 24 to 105 USM IS-II. Positives of the Canon C70. The Canon C70 is approved by Netflix, which doesn't mean a whole lot nowadays, but it's a surface level indicator for the quality that comes out of this camera. Let's start at the top of the list of favorable attributes to the Canon C70. Right on top of that list is the ergonomics. I'm used to shooting on DSLRs, which means that the switch over to the Canon C70 would be a natural transition, as it's pretty much just a giant DSLR. Even Gerald agrees with me, right?
Yep.
I come from a Canon 90D, which is a DSLR, and I'm going to let Gerald describe how it feels to hold.
Physically, it feels like you're holding the biggest DSLR of all time.
Thanks, Gerald. And personally, I feel like that's a positive. At least for me it is. It does address a lot of issues with the Canon 90D, which I'm actually making a video on, and that will be out next week. The larger record button comes to mind, and also the 3.5mm jack, which has just failed on my 90D. If you're interested into the downfalls of the Canon 90D, I have a video out right now on that camera. If you're watching this on the day of release, it will be out next week. Consider subscribing, because that video is coming soon. If you're watching this later, it's already out. The second positive for the Canon C70 is related to the ergonomics, and that is the run and gun features that it has. Right out of box, if you just stick on a microphone and a lens, you're good to go out and shoot. That's hard to say for most cameras at this price point. I mean, that's a major downfall for the RED Komodo, for me at least. Having to spend a lot of your precious time and money on attachments and rigging it out, I could be using that precious time for much more important things, like responding to comments or sending out that all-important tweet. The third and final positive in this video for the Canon C70 is the fact that this camera has dual card slots, which is fantastic. I've never had an SD card fail, but I hear it's not very fun. And with the dual card slots, there's the redundancy built right in. Now that I've rambled on about the positives of the Canon C70, let's dive into the negatives. Compared to the RED Komodo, it has a much lower resolution, 6K down to 4K. You're losing a whole 2Ks here. Although 4K is still impressive, it isn't at the forefront of what cameras are doing right now. We have 8K coming out of the Canon R5C, or 12K coming out of the Blackmagics. But 4K is probably sufficient for what I need right now. Would it be nice to have more resolution? Of course, it always would be. That's why this is still a negative. But 4K video on this level is different than 4K off of your smartphone. We're talking about Canon 4K here. This isn't the line skipping 4K. This is fine quality 4K. Not to mention the Canon color science. Everybody raves on about that, and this has that. Let's get back to the negatives. I know I'm having a bit of trouble being negative today. I'm usually not this negative. But the other thing is that it looks like a DSLR camera. So if you're wanting to look more professional in the cinema world, maybe a big DSLR isn't the way to go. Unfortunately, in the industry that we play around with, size does matter. Looks are important. Your R5C with the compact L series lens isn't going to be nearly as impressive as a lower quality and bigger, cheaper camera and lens setup. And here's a little tip for you. Even if you don't need it, throw a matte box on it. Everyone knows that matte boxes add plus 10 onto your cinematography. The third negative for the Canon C70 is that having the ergonomics of a DSLR does make it a lot harder to rig up than the straight up cube that is the RED Komodo. The RED Komodo is a dream when it comes to rigging, as that's what's supposed to happen to it. Whereas the C70, not so much. You'll definitely need a cage. From everything I've seen online, you're gonna need a good one, as the quarter 20 holes on the bottom run perpendicular instead of parallel with your camera. A cage is pretty much a must if you're going to be putting anything onto this camera. In the end, it's a close race, and I still haven't fully decided, but I'll most likely go with the Canon C70. Let me know down in the comments if you think that's a wrong choice, and explain why. I might choose the Canon C70 over the RED Komodo. However, the C70 isn't the final one, as I'm currently working on a video of a comparison between the Canon C70 and the Sony FX6. Subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss it when that video comes out. So that is the end of my video. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you fine internet folks next Tuesday morning. If you want your wildlife or pet footage with a shout out at the end of my video, send it to me for a chance to be featured with a shout out at the end of my videos.